Hello, everybody. It's me, Fee, or Fiona Timms, otherwise known as White Zulu, author of my autobiography of the same name. And I welcome you all to another chapter of my book. I do hope you're all enjoying my life story, and I must thank all of you for being such dedicated subscribers, especially those who have written such complimentary comments below my videos. They are much appreciated. I would like to point out that the previous South African flag hanging on the wall behind me is not a political statement. It is simply a piece of history in the background of my first 50 years of my life, being born and growing up in my beloved mother country, South Africa. My autobiography, White Zulu, is not a political commentary, and frankly describes my experiences of growing up with the Zulu tribe as my family. That flag is simply a piece of cloth signifying the history of South Africa. It was originally used by the Union of South Africa from 1928 to 1961, and later the Republic of South Africa until 1994.
We were on our way to Inhambane, the halfway point where, according to our itinerary, we'd refuel, and then on to Vilankulos, the tiny port, which was the nearest departure point to get to Paradise Island. We flew for hours, low and slow, and I gazed at the coastline as we went. Now and again, I saw a semicircle of thin wooden poles in the shallows of the crystal clear sea, stuck upright into the sand, and a small cluster of reed-thatched huts in the scrubby dunes just behind the beach. "Fish traps!" shouted the pilot when, by using hand gestures and pointing, Fred asked him what they were. We learned later that the local tribes living way out there in the middle of nowhere waded out at high tide and unrolled and fastened lengths of woven reeds to the poles. When the tide receded, small to medium fish remained trapped in the clever half-moon of reed fencing, and the women could then paddle back in and pick the flapping fish out with their hands. It had to be their only source of food, that, and whatever berries, roots, and possibly small game animals they could hunt. They'd been fishing like this for centuries. They dried part of the catch on horizontal racks made from similar poles and reeds, in the furnace-like heat of the sun, so they had something they could survive on in leaner times, or possibly to use to trade with other tribes for different food. On my starboard side, where the ocean lay, I stared into the tranquility of the shallow-looking water. We were so low I could clearly see the shadow of our little aircraft on the white, rippled, sandy bottom. Now and again I saw a huge, dark shape swimming slowly. "Sharks!" elaborated our snuffling, wheezing pilot when Fred pointed excitedly at them. English monosyllables were this man's limit, but it was sufficient information for us, all we needed to know. It was too noisy for much the other than shouted conversation in the little single prop, as this was long before luxuries like headsets and other forms of internal communication. He bellowed something now and again in Portuguese into the radio mic, getting an indecipherably crackling, hissing reply, probably from air traffic control. Eventually, After a couple of hours in the rather cramped plain, we swooped into Inhamban and landed on a strip that was more sand than grass and very uneven. After we'd bounced to our halt, the pilot gave a large, wet sniff and opened up the doors for us. I had to use the wing as a step and then hopped down to land ankle deep in the searing hot sand. The air was oven-like and a hot wind blew off the inland bushveld, a complete contrast from the cool sea breeze we'd enjoyed during the flight. While a black Mozambican wearing nothing but a raggedy pair of khaki shorts filled the plane's tanks with fuel from a 44-gallon drum he'd rolled over the sand to where we were, our rheumy-eyed pilot disappeared into the corrugated tin shed without a word, and Fred and I attempted to stretch our legs by strolling around, but found the sand was just too hot for comfort as it trickled through the openings of our sandals. I'd kicked mine off in the plane, as I hate wearing anything on my feet, and that applies to today as well, and had been just about to jump down barefoot onto the so-called airstrip when I'd seen some vicious-looking devil thorns lurking there, half hidden. These were off the acacia trees and formed a tripod of 3-inch long spikes, cunningly evolved so that one point always stuck up vertically, the other two forming a support. I'd trodden on one of those in my childhood when holidaying in the game reserve, and had learnt the hard way to always wear sandals in the bushveld. Some species of thorn trees produced 3-hook hakis, 3-cornered spikes, so big and strong they could puncture a tractor tire with ease. Many an elephant had become permanently lame after treading on one of them, and being unable to remove the thorn embedded in its foot, eventually died of gangrene. After about 20 minutes, the pilot reappeared carrying 3 cans of Fanta, and we all half stood, half crouched in the inadequate shade of the plane's wing, the sun blasting reflected heat off the white sand as we drank our lukewarm fizzy drinks, before reboarding and taking off, this time for Vilanculos, a minute fishing port up the coast. It was more of the same scenery that we'd passed over on our way up from LM earlier that morning, the fish traps with their attendant reed huts and those sinister-looking, enormous dark shapes in the sea. I didn't see any signs of human habitation other than those scarcely scattered, sorry, I'm doing this so badly, sparsely scattered kraals on the sea's edge. Inland, there was nothing. The thornveld stretched out to the horizon as far as I could see. No rivers, no oases, and definitely no buildings. It was pristine African veldt, and I couldn't get enough of it. I was certainly glad that we'd flown, though. There was no choice, really. There were no roads. Anyone that wanted to make the journey, like Robin, my brother-in-law, and his mates occasionally did, had to form a plentifully fueled, well-stocked convoy of 4x4 vehicles and drive along the beach at low tide and behind the dunes at high tide. Before they went, they would have to make sure that there would be a full moon so they could take advantage of the spring tides that it brought. Or they went by sea, hugging the coast in a small boat. To get there and back by either means would have taken almost the entire 2 weeks we'd each managed to get off work. Apart from being such fun, flying was by far the best way to see the country, a bird's eye view. After another 2 hours low, slow flying, we banked sharply and landed at Vilanculos. Not much bigger than Inhamban, where we'd refueled. This tiny fishing port had palm trees growing around the airstrip, and being right on the sea's edge, we saw dhows drifting gently about on the still, calm blue water, exactly the same kind as I'd seen in pictures of Arabs sailing on the Nile. They looked serene and graceful with their strangely broken-looking single masts at a rakish angle and rigged with lateen sails. Vilanculos had a few Portuguese European-built shops, offices, and possibly a hotel. It was hard to tell from the airstrip. Some were double-story and all looked shabby, with the whitewash peeling off, cracked walls, and strictly utilitarian. This was one of 2 access points from which we could reach Paradise Island and Bazaruto. The other was in Hasoro, an even smaller fishing port than Vilanculos, several hundred miles further up the coast. We had 2 choices: take a 4.5-hour ferry ride to the tiny island, or fly in by plane. Oddly enough, we'd been told we had to take the ferry back to the mainland after our 2 weeks stay. There was no flight out. This was rather puzzling, since, if a plane could fly us in, surely it would be able to fly us out again. Then we saw the plane that was to take us to Paradise Island. A 2-seater with a sort of cubbyhole just behind the 2 seats. There was a lot of fuss and shouting in Portuguese as the white pilot gave instructions to 2 local Africans as to how to load our luggage. Clearly, he'd done this many times before. He got them to stuff the dinghy into the hold, which filled it completely. Then he slung both our small canvas bags into the cubbyhole. That left the paddle and spear gun, which he had them then strap onto the outside of the tiny plane, using some frayed rope. The spear gun was barely shorter than the fuselage, just clear of the propeller. And I remembered Robin's words about the East Portuguese air safety record. And where was I going to sit? The stocky, grumpy pilot, dressed in torn khaki shorts and shirt, motioned for Fred to get into the co-pilot's seat. Once he was settled in, he told me to climb up and sit on Fred's lap. It was quite a squash, as, even though I was reed slim, I'm 5'8" and Fred was 6'2". We sort of entwined our legs around each other's, as we had to keep our feet absolutely clear of the dual control rudders, as well as hold our bodies away from the joystick, which, although small, jutted out substantially. There was no way we were able to pull the seat belt over our laps, but the pilot ignored all that and climbed into his own seat and started up. The flight is only about 20 minutes, he explained, as he must have seen some degree of apprehension on our faces. We won't be long in the air. And with that he taxied down the uneven semi-grass sand strip. With a long run and a lot of revving, the microscopic and clearly overloaded plane finally heaved itself into the air, and we banked in a semicircle and flew over the sandy beach and out to sea. Paradise Island lies in the Mozambique Channel between the mainland and the rather bigger Bazaruta archipelago. Archipelago. Shaped like a bent thigh bone, it has a sand strip just long enough for a two or single-seater plane to land, but not long enough for a loaded two-seater to take off. Hence the fact that we'd have to go back to Vilanculos on the ferry after our 2 weeks there. These days, in the 21st century, the smaller islands like Bartholomew Dias Island pop out of the sea at low tide, then disappear again when the tide is high. Due to global warming, all the smaller islands are disappearing completely. After we disentangled ourselves and the cursing, sweating pilot had untied our paddle and dumped our bags and boat onto the hot white sand, he took off again. Landing had been hairy enough, as we'd come in lower and lower, with only sea below us, no signs of any land. And just as we expected the wheels to dip into the water, had bumped onto the fine sand on the very edge of a sheer drop of several 100 feet. We'd then come to a stop, slowed by the deep sand, just in front of some bent palm trees. The noise of the plane must have alerted the hotel, and a stripped-down jeep, driven by an African Portuguese man, came slowly jolting along to park in the shade of the palms clustered about at the very furthest edge of the strip we just landed on. After loading our things into the jeep, he and the pilot manually turned the plane around, and without ceremony it took off again, only just clearing the drop-off before the wheels left the sand. It had all been very exciting, rather too much so, and Fred and I hadn't exchanged any conversation. We'd been entwined close together as closely as vines, and been really apprehensive about how the cramped little plane was going to land on an apparently non-existent strip. We were also really hot and sweaty after being in such close quarters, as the temperature was well into the high 50s already, and it wasn't quite midday. The jeep took us to a scattering of about 6 square prefab huts, which stood on concrete bases and were joined by rough concrete paths. They were not attractive. The walls had once been lime-washed in some pale pinkish colour, which had begun peeling off, and the roofs were flat and made of corrugated asbestos. The huts were shaded by a combination of straggly, stunted scrub pines, huge hibiscus shrubs, all of which were in full flower, displaying their enormous scarlet, pink and orange yellow flowers to their full beauty. We were shown to a hut which was to be our home for the next 2 weeks, and gratefully we grabbed our swimming costumes, a couple of cheap, rough, greyish towels, and headed for the beach. It was as beautiful as one can imagine. When you look at those photos of the most exquisitely exclusive beaches in the Bahamas, where there are long white beaches, flat transparent trees, seas, and palm trees, leaning over towards the sand. This is what we found, and once in the water, we discovered it was almost lukewarm and absolutely delightful. Paradise Island certainly lived up to its name and was regarded as the jewel of the 5 islands forming the Bazaruto I can't say this word, archipelago. It's the only coral rock island in the archipelago, and it's just over 2 miles in length and surrounded by turquoise waters, beautiful beaches, and shallow reefs. It's also the island where Bob Dylan composed his song, Mozambique. In the 1950s, Joaquim Alves, a flamboyant Portuguese businessman, controlled the coast from Beira to Vilanculos, roughly 160 miles, and married a local Mozambique woman. After which he focused his efforts on the tiny Santa Carolina island, named after her, where he built a hotel that, for 20 years, was very popular with honeymooners and others. However, unbeknown to us, Mozambique was in the first throes of a war of independence, and in 1973, towards the end of that war, just 3 years after we were there. No, it wasn't towards the end of that war, nor that. Just 3 years after we were there, Joaquim Alves abandoned the hotel. It was the beginning of the war. Santa Carolina became a no-go area occupied by Frelimo, the Liberation Front of Mozambique. After independence in 1975, the Civil War ensued, 1975 to 1992. But under the new government, the Frelimo personnel on the island, who often used those lovely reefs and rocky outcrops for grenade launching target practice, were moved to the mainland. Most of the rooms were vandalized by the troops that occupied the island. After 20 years, nearly 20 years of bitter warfare, the existing hotel was left derelict and in ruins. In 1970, when we were there, fresh drinking water had to be brought onto the island by ferry in 44-gallon drums, and there was no water at all on Bazaruto, and therefore no hotel, which was ideal as it remained pristine and only used by the hardcore fishermen such as Robin, who camped there, having to take all their own provisions as well as drinking water. Nicolette told me that they'd had to buy live chickens on the mainland to take over on the boats as there was no refrigeration. They'd had also taken a cook with them, a very old local fellow whom Robin had called Charlie, as he couldn't pronounce his Portuguese tribal name, and Nicolette saw him wash up the cutlery by simply wiping it clean on the pinafore, his pinafore. That's enough for this week. There's more to come. I hope you're enjoying it. I must thank John Moslane, my sound engineer, for making this possible. I'll say hi to Tony, Clive, Henry, and Scott. You all appear to be enjoying this. And I'll see you next week. Goodbye.
That is all for the time being, and there's more to come next week. I would like to thank John Moslane for putting aside his Friday afternoons to help me produce these videos. Without him, I could not do this. I would also like to thank Sean van Vuren for his sterling work in uploading my videos to my YouTube channel, adding the photos, as well as managing my channel so professionally. If you would like to know more about my other works, I have written 5 books in all, and each one is autobiographical. Please visit my website at www.whitezulubook.com, where you will find a lot more information as well as plenty of photographs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed my life story, and there is plenty more to come. A thumbnail photo will be attached each week, and thank you so much for all your support and all the very kind remarks you make in complimenting me on my work. I really appreciate it. Goodbye.